I grew up in Arizona but moved to New Mexico for work a few years ago. I love camping and have spent a lot of time in the desert, so I'm not easily scared by the wilderness. But this trip changed how I see the outdoors forever. It was late September, and the weather was perfect. Not too hot during the day and cool at night. I had a 3-day weekend and wanted to get out of the city, so I packed up my gear and drove about 3 hours northwest of Albuquerque to a remote area near the Jemez Mountains. It wasn't a popular camping spot, which is exactly what I wanted. No tourists, no loud groups. Just me, my tent, and the quiet of the desert. I reached the area around mid-afternoon, parked my truck on a dirt trail, and hiked about 2 miles in. The terrain was mostly flat with scattered juniper trees and dry brush. In the distance, the hills rolled up into red rock formations. It was beautiful but desolate. I set up my tent near a small, dried-up creek bed and started a fire as the sun began to set. That first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, watched the stars, and listened to the distant sound of coyotes howling. I've heard them plenty of times before, but something about their cries that night felt off. It wasn't just the usual yipping and howling. There was something else, pattern to it, almost like words. I pushed the thought away, telling myself I was imagining things. But even as I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I woke up early, made some coffee, and decided to go for a short hike before it got too hot. The land stretched out endlessly, untouched and empty. But as I walked further from camp, I noticed something strange. Tracks. Not animal tracks, not human either. They were deep, like something heavy had walked through. The shape was wrong, like a human footprint but longer, distorted. Almost like someone had been walking on all fours. I knelt down and examined them. They led from the brush toward the general direction of my camp but stopped suddenly, as if whatever made them had just disappeared. A chill ran through me. The ground was dry and dusty. There was no way the tracks could just stop like that. I looked around, trying to find where they continued, but they were just gone. I felt exposed standing there, like I was being watched. I slowly turned in a circle, scanning the area, but I saw nothing, just the endless desert. I forced myself to shake it off and headed back to camp. By late afternoon, I was feeling better. I spent the day exploring and didn't see anything else weird. I convinced myself the tracks had been an animal, maybe distorted by the wind or erosion. As the sun started to set, I built another fire and sat down to eat. That's when I smelled it, a horrible, rotten stench, like something dead and baking in the sun. Came out of nowhere, thick and sour, making my stomach turn. I stood up and looked around, trying to find the source, but the smell seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was strong, overwhelming. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The silence that followed felt unnatural. The desert is never truly silent. There's always the rustle of wind, the distant call of an animal. But at that moment, everything had stopped. No wind.
No insects. No distant coyotes.
Nothing. I felt my skin crawl. Something was out there. Something was close. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The beam cut through the night, but I saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just outside my vision, watching me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I forced myself to lie down in my tent, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept listening, waiting. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. It was close. I held my breath, listening. The sound circled my camp, stopping, starting again. Then came the worst part. A voice. It was low, broken, like someone trying to speak but not knowing how. It came from just beyond my tent, whispering my name. It was my voice. I felt frozen, unable to move. My own voice calling out from the darkness. It was impossible. The whispering stopped, then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the exhaustion won, and I must have passed out. I woke up at dawn, disoriented and on edge. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. But when I stepped outside my tent, I saw them. More tracks. They circled my camp, leading up to the door of my tent, then stopping. Like whatever it was had been standing right outside, watching me sleep. I packed up in record time, shoving my gear into my pack without bothering to organize it. As I hoisted my bag onto my back, that stench returned, stronger this time. I didn't look back. I hiked to my truck as fast as I could, ignoring the feeling that something was just behind me. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside and started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and I saw it, a figure standing at the tree line, too tall, its limbs too long, watching. I drove without stopping, without looking back again. I didn't breathe normally until I was miles away. I never went back to that area. For weeks, I felt like something was still watching me. Even in my apartment, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced something was outside my window. I don't know what I saw in that desert, but I know it wasn't human, and I know it wasn't alone. I never planned on camping alone in a forgotten part of the countryside, especially not in the middle of a storm, but sometimes life just pushes you into strange places. It was late September, and I had taken a week off work to escape the city. I just wanted some time to myself, no emails, no traffic, no people. I had picked the West Midlands, an area known for its rolling hills and old forests, but I hadn't realized just how isolated some parts could be. I had read about an abandoned campsite in an old hiking book, a place that had once been popular in the 1980s but had been shut down due to financial issues. It was supposed to be just off a trail near the Wyre Forest, not too far from Kidderminster. I liked the idea of it, somewhere remote but with enough history to make it interesting. When I arrived, the sky was already darkening with thick, gray clouds. The drive had been longer than expected, mostly due to narrow country roads that seemed to twist endlessly between farmland and trees. My car's GPS lost signal about half an hour before I reached the site, so I had to rely on a printed map. The last stretch was a dirt track, barely wide enough for my car, with deep puddles from earlier rain. When I finally parked at the edge of the old campsite, the place looked exactly as I imagined. Abandoned, overgrown, and forgotten. The entrance sign was still there, though the paint had faded and the wooden posts were rotting at the base. Tall grass had taken over the gravel paths, and the old concrete fire pits were cracked and filled with rainwater. A few wooden structures, likely old storage sheds or communal areas, stood in the distance, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. I set up my tent near what looked like the main clearing. The grass was damp but manageable. As I hammered the last peg into the ground, the wind picked up, shaking the trees and sending a deep chill through the air. The first drops of rain hit my jacket. Within minutes, it became a downpour. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and listened to the rain hammer against the fabric. I wasn't scared, just uncomfortable. I had packed well dry clothes, a warm sleeping bag, even a small gas stove for tea. It was supposed to be a quiet, relaxing night. But then things started to feel off. It began with small noises. First, I thought it was just the rain or the wind shifting the trees. But as I sat there, drinking tea from my thermos, I noticed something different. The sound of footsteps. Not close, not loud, but definitely there. faint crunching through the wet grass, moving slowly, stopping, then starting again. I turned off my flashlight, listening harder. Nothing, just the rain. Maybe it had been my imagination. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in a strange place. Still, I felt uneasy. I decided to check outside. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My headlamp cut through the rain, revealing only the wet grass, trees, and the abandoned structures in the distance. No movement, no signs of anyone. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, and crawled back inside, but sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled through the trees, making the old wooden sheds creak in the distance. I dozed in and out, waking up every time the rain hit harder or the wind shifted. Then, around midnight, I heard something that made my stomach drop. Not footsteps this time, a sound much worse. Breathing. It was right outside my tent. Deep, steady breathing, just inches from the thin fabric separating me from the outside world. I froze. I didn't move. I barely even breathed myself. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't moving. They were just standing there, breathing. I reached slowly for my headlamp, careful not to make a sound. My hand trembled as I switched it on. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, then unzipped the tent and shined the light outside. Nothing. No footprints in the mud. No movement in the grass. Just the endless rain pouring down. I stayed awake for hours after that, gripping the small camping knife I had packed. Every little sound made my muscles tense. I kept telling myself it had been the wind, my own breathing echoing in my tent, anything but the alternative, that someone had been standing just outside watching me. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I stepped outside, exhausted but needing to see for myself. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The ground was soaked, thick with mud. I walked around my tent, scanning for footprints. That's when I saw them. A set of footprints circling my tent. Deep, fresh, unmistakably human. But that wasn't the worst part. Whoever it was hadn't walked up to my tent from the trees. The footprints only started a few feet away from where I had been sleeping, like they had just appeared there, as if they had been standing still watching for hours. I packed my things in record time. The idea of spending another night there wasn't an option. As I threw my gear into the car, I looked back at the abandoned campsite one last time. The rain had washed away most of the tracks, but I could still see them faintly in the mud. The shape of bare feet. No shoes, no socks. I drove out of there as fast as the muddy roads would allow. A week later, back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been seriously wrong about that place. I searched online for anything about the campsite. Most of what I found were old forum posts and camping blogs, people sharing memories of staying there in the 80s before it shut down. But then I found something else. A news article from 1994. A hiker had gone missing in that exact area. His campsite had been found abandoned, his footprints circling his tent in the mud, just like mine. His car was still parked nearby, untouched. No sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing stolen. They never found him. The search lasted for weeks before they gave up. The only clue? Witnesses from nearby villages claimed they had seen a man walking the roads at night, barefoot. I haven't been camping alone since. I've always liked camping alone. Something about being far from people, away from the sounds of cars and city life, makes me feel calm. I've been doing it for years, and nothing ever really scared me. Sure, I've had weird moments, strange sounds at night, animals getting too close, but I always found a logical reason for everything. That's why, when I look back at what happened, I still struggle to understand how I made it out. This happened in the summer of 2019. I was 32 at the time, and I had taken a week off work just to be out in the woods. I chose a spot in Montana, deep in the wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. I had done my research, looking at maps and checking for any old trails that weren't too well known. I wanted to be somewhere isolated, somewhere no one else would bother me. I drove for hours, first on paved roads, then onto rough dirt trails. My truck bounced over rocks and potholes, the trees closing in on both sides as I went deeper into the forest. Eventually, I reached a spot that felt right, a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect. No signs of other campers, no trash, no old fire pits, just untouched land. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started settling in. The first day went by peacefully. I fished in the stream, cooked my food over the fire, and just enjoyed the silence. As the sun set, I felt completely at ease. But then, around midnight, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and my tent was silent. I lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had pulled me from my sleep. That's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate movement just outside my tent. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer sound like, what bears sound like. This was different. It was footsteps, careful, measured, like someone was trying not to be heard. My heart started pounding. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my tent once, then stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a tree branch had fallen. Maybe I had just dreamed the sound. I forced myself to relax, and somehow I fell back asleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been near my tent. Still, I couldn't shake the unease I felt. I spent the day hiking, trying to enjoy myself, but the feeling never really left. That night, I made sure to keep my fire going longer. I stayed up later, listening to the woods, waiting. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, I let myself believe that the night before had just been my mind playing tricks on me. But then, around 3 a.m., something woke me again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Low, slow breathing just outside my tent. My stomach clenched. I wanted to move, to reach for my knife, but I was frozen. The breathing was so close I could hear the slight wheeze in it, like whoever or whatever was out there had a problem with their lungs. I forced myself to stay quiet. My tent was zipped up, but the fabric was thin. If someone wanted to get in, nothing would stop them. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, just listening. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. I didn't move for the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, my hands shaking. I looked around, but once again, there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I decided to stay one more night. Looking back, I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to believe that something was really wrong. Maybe I was too stubborn to leave. I spent the day trying to enjoy myself, but by the time the sun started setting, I was on edge. I kept my fire burning bright, my knife within reach. I told myself that if I heard anything again, I would leave at first light. Then, just past midnight, I heard something new. It was a voice. It was distant at first, carried by the wind. A man's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was getting closer. Then I realized something that made my skin crawl. There was no emotion in the voice, no rise or fall, just flat, empty words. And whoever was speaking wasn't answering anyone. There was only one voice. It stopped suddenly, cutting off mid-sentence. The silence that followed was worse. I gripped my knife, my whole body tense. Then, from just beyond the light of my fire, I heard something new. Laughter. Low, quiet laughter. Then the footsteps started. Slow, deliberate steps, just like the first night. moving closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and shined it into the trees. Nothing, but the footsteps kept coming. I grabbed my keys, unzipped my tent, and bolted for my truck. I didn't care about my gear. I just ran. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. My headlights flashed across the trees, and that's when I saw him, a man standing just at the edge of the clearing. He was tall, skinny, and dressed in old, ragged clothes. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth was open slightly, like he had just been laughing. Then, as my headlights hit him, he turned and walked back into the trees. Not running, not hiding, just walking. I didn't stay to see where he went. I threw my truck into reverse, spun around, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I sat there, shaking, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I never went back for my gear. I don't know who he was. Maybe some hermit living in the woods. Maybe something worse. All I know is that I was completely alone, miles from anyone, and somehow he had found me. It was the middle of August when my wife, Rachel, her mother, and I decided to go camping in the mountains. We'd been planning the trip for months. It was going to be a relaxing few days in nature. No phone service, just the sound of the trees and the crackling of a campfire. The plan was to camp in a secluded spot by a small lake, far enough away from the nearest trail to avoid the usual weekend crowds. The weather forecast looked perfect, warm during the day and cool at night. We were excited, but things didn't turn out the way we expected. We packed our gear in the SUV the night before, making sure we had everything: tents, sleeping bags, food, and a cooler full of drinks. Rachel's mom, Sharon, was in her late 50s, a bit more cautious than Rachel and I, but still adventurous for her age. Rachel and I were both in our early 30s, and we all shared the same idea of getting away from the noise of the city and into the stillness of the forest. The drive up the mountain was peaceful, with the sun rising behind us, casting a soft glow over the winding roads. The trees were thick on either side of the narrow path, and as we got further from civilization, the air smelled cleaner, fresher. We talked, joked, and planned for the days ahead. We arrived at the campsite around noon, just as the sun was hitting its peak. The spot we'd chosen was perfect, right by the water, surrounded by tall pines and a thick underbrush. After setting up camp, we decided to take a walk around the lake. Rachel and Sharon were already chatting about the best fishing spots, while I tried to take in the quiet, listening to the sounds of the wind rustling the trees and the distant call of birds. We walked for about an hour, following the shoreline, until we found a small clearing. The ground was soft and moss-covered, and there was a log to sit on near the water's edge. We stopped there for a while, enjoying the peace and the beautiful view. But then something caught my eye. Across the lake, at the edge of the trees, I saw movement, something dark and fast darting between the trunks. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it seemed too quick and too low to the ground to be a person. I didn't say anything right away, not wanting to spook Rachel or her mom. Maybe it was a deer or a bear, something I could easily explain away. We eventually made our way back to camp, where we spent the rest of the afternoon lounging and preparing dinner. The air cooled down as the sun dipped behind the mountains, and we lit a small campfire. Sharon made some hot dogs, while Rachel and I opened a couple of beers and enjoyed the warmth from the fire. The evening was calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept thinking about that strange movement across the lake. As night fell, we all went to bed early. The sky was clear, and the stars above were brighter than I'd seen in years. Rachel and I shared a tent, and her mom had her own. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. I fell asleep quickly, but I woke up just past midnight, feeling restless. I lay there for a while, staring at the inside of the tent. Then, I heard something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from just outside. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something smaller moving through the campsite. But then, I heard a rustling sound near the entrance of the tent, followed by a low, scraping noise, as if something had brushed against the canvas. My heart began to race. I carefully unzipped the tent, just a crack, and peeked out. The fire was out, but there was a faint glow from the stars. The campsite was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't see anything unusual, but my instincts were telling me that something wasn't right. I closed the tent and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily after that. I kept listening, waiting for any sound that would tell me I was just imagining things. The next morning, I didn't mention what had happened to Rachel or Sharon. They were still asleep when I got up, and I didn't want to alarm them. I spent some time checking the campsite, making sure everything was secure, but I found nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been nearby. We spent the rest of the day fishing and hiking. We didn't talk much about the weird feeling I had the night before, but it lingered in my mind. In the afternoon, we decided to hike further into the woods, away from the lake. The path was rougher here, and we had to be careful not to trip on the uneven ground. Rachel was ahead of me, her mom bringing up the rear, when I suddenly heard something snap behind us, like a twig breaking, loud and sharp. I stopped, holding my breath. Rachel turned around, looking confused. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I just shook my head. I didn't want to sound paranoid. We continued hiking, but the unsettling feeling returned. It was like someone was following us, keeping just out of sight. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, always too quick to identify. But Rachel and Sharon didn't seem to notice. The woods were dense, and the afternoon light was fading fast. We decided to head back to camp before it got too dark. By the time we reached the campsite, the sky was deep blue, and the air was getting colder. As I was setting up the fire, Rachel went to grab more wood from the pile we'd gathered earlier. I watched her go and then heard a voice behind me. "You've been acting strange today," Sharon said quietly. "Is everything okay?" I wasn't sure how to answer. I didn't want to scare her or Rachel, but something was definitely off. "I don't know," I said after a pause. I don't like how quiet it is here. It feels like we're being watched." Sharon didn't seem convinced. "You're probably just tired. It's been a long couple of days." That night, I couldn't sleep again. The noises from the forest were more persistent now. Scratching at the tents, footsteps around the camp. I was about to get up and check things out when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, low and distant, calling from the trees. It wasn't a human voice, not really. It was more like a growl, mixed with a soft, rasping sound, as if whatever was making it couldn't quite speak. It was coming from the far side of the camp, near the lake. My heart pounded, and I froze, not knowing what to do. I didn't want to wake Rachel or Sharon, but I couldn't ignore the sound. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. I finally decided to get up and check it out. Quietly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was damp, and the ground felt soft under my boots. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, its beam cutting through the dark. I moved cautiously toward the lake, trying to be as quiet as possible, but the crunch of the leaves under my feet sounded unnaturally loud. As I reached the water's edge, I stopped. The noise had stopped too. The entire forest was still. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the rustling of trees and the gentle lapping of the water. But then I saw it. A figure, hunched low and moving quickly along the shore, darted between the trees. It was too fast, too strange to be a person. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my legs go weak. I took a step back, my foot landing on a rock, and the sound broke the silence. The figure froze, and for a split second, I saw its eyes, wide and reflective in the moonlight. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't human either. I ran back to camp, my heart racing, adrenaline flooding my system. I didn't stop until I was back inside the tent with Rachel and Sharon, but I didn't say anything. Couldn't. The next morning, we packed up and left. We didn't stay for another night. As we drove down the mountain, I kept looking back, half expecting to see something following us through the trees. We never spoke about what happened in the woods, but the memory stayed with me, haunting me. I'm not sure what I saw that night, but I know this. Something was out there with us, and it wasn't friendly. It was a quiet evening when I decided to camp alone on an old, forgotten farm on the outskirts of town. I was 28 years old, and after a few hectic weeks, I needed to clear my head. The farm had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. My parents had told me stories about it when I was younger. They'd warned me that the place had a creepy reputation, especially with its eerie graveyard that sat near the back of the land. But I wasn't one to shy away from a bit of unsettling atmosphere. The idea of spending the night in such a place, far from the noise of the city, seemed perfect. The drive there was long, filled with narrow, winding roads. As I got closer, the terrain changed from the usual suburban sprawl to wild, untamed fields. I passed a few dilapidated houses, their structures sagging under the weight of time. The sun was beginning to set by the time I arrived, casting a golden glow on everything around me. It gave the whole place a feeling of being stuck in time, like it was from a forgotten era. The farm had an old stone wall that ran around its perimeter, with gaps in it where nature had slowly taken over. Tall grass and thorny bushes grew in every direction. There was a large barn, its roof collapsed in on itself, and a crumbling farmhouse at the end of the field. The graveyard, as expected, was just beyond the barn. It was barely visible at first, hidden behind some trees and overgrown bushes. I felt a strange pull toward it, but pushed the thought aside. I wasn't there for the graveyard, just to get some peace and solitude. I parked my truck at the edge of the farm near a small clearing and set up camp. The campfire crackled as I dug a small pit and piled the dry wood I had brought. The sound of the fire and the wind rustling through the trees was oddly calming. There was something beautiful about how quiet it was. No cars, no people, just the sounds of nature and the occasional distant caw of a crow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and I wrapped myself in a jacket, sipping on a flask of warm tea. I had no phone signal out here, but I didn't mind. The isolation felt freeing in a way. I glanced at the dark outline of the barn, where the graveyard was nearby. It was probably just a bunch of old, forgotten graves, but there was something unsettling about it. I had always been curious about what lay there, but the thought of walking through that silent cemetery made my skin crawl. Night fell completely, and the stars emerged, shining brightly in the pitch-black sky. The moon was just a sliver, barely casting any light. The firelight flickered, throwing shadows that seemed to dance around the clearing. After a while, I felt like I could relax, but the feeling that I was being watched started to creep in. I told myself it was just the quiet of the night playing tricks on my mind. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, just beyond the campfire's glow. I turned sharply toward it, expecting to see an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but there was nothing. The sound stopped, leaving an uncomfortable stillness in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and walked slowly toward the barn. I wasn't sure why I felt drawn to it, but the unease was building up inside me. I approached the barn, the wooden beams creaking as I stepped closer. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, landing on the old stone foundation. The barn had been abandoned for years, but it didn't seem as dilapidated as the farmhouse. There was a strange sense of stillness around it, as though the land itself had been waiting for someone to return. The rustling sound came again, closer this time. My heart started to race, but I ignored the fear rising in my chest and walked further into the dark. As I neared the graveyard, I noticed the faint outlines of headstones peeking through the thick underbrush. Some were toppled over, others barely visible under layers of moss. I couldn't tell how old they were, but the place had an air of neglect, like no one had been here in decades. I shone my flashlight over the gravestones. They looked weathered, but there was something about the names carved into the stone that sent a chill down my spine. Some were completely illegible, others half erased by time. But what caught my attention was one stone in particular. It was newer than the rest. It didn't belong here, almost like someone had recently placed it. The name on it was something I couldn't quite make out. My flashlight flickered as I leaned in closer to examine it. As I did, I heard a soft thud behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the wind blowing through the trees. My pulse quickened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That was when I realized how completely alone I was. The silence of the night was overwhelming, and the air had turned heavy. I stood there for a moment, torn between staying to figure out what was going on and running back to my camp. My feet felt like they were frozen to the ground, and for the first time since I arrived, I was genuinely afraid. The rustling came again, louder this time, but there was no animal in sight. The air felt colder, and I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone out here. My flashlight flickered again, then went out entirely. I quickly checked the batteries, but they seemed fine. The feeling of being watched intensified, and it was as if the whole farm was alive, watching my every move. I turned and started walking back toward the clearing. The graveyard was silent again, but the eerie sense of presence lingered. The campfire was still burning when I returned, but the shadows seemed longer now, stretching further than they should have. I tried to push the unsettling feeling out of my mind and sat back down by the fire. The wind started to pick up, causing the trees to sway and creak in the distance. The fire crackled loudly in the quiet, and I stared at the dancing flames. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the noises were just animals in the night. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, I heard it again, a loud thud, much closer this time, like something large hitting the ground. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up quickly, scanning the area around the fire. Everything seemed still, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. I grabbed my flashlight again and shone it toward the barn, the graveyard, the dark corners of the clearing, but nothing. Nothing except the trees, the dark, and the flickering light of the campfire. Then, as I was about to sit back down, I noticed something odd. There, just at the edge of the firelight, was a figure, a shadow. I froze. It was tall and indistinct, but its outline was unmistakable. It wasn't human, not really. The shape was wrong, too tall, too thin. It seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways, as if it were shifting with the wind. My flashlight shone directly on it, but the figure vanished in an instant, like smoke dissolving into the night. My heart was pounding in my chest. I thought about running, but I didn't know where I'd go. I was surrounded by darkness, and the farm seemed to stretch on forever. I sat back down, trying to steady my breathing. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of dread continued to claw at me. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside the firelight seemed amplified. Each rustle, each creak of the trees, felt like something was coming closer. I barely moved, only watching the dark edges of the camp, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I packed up my things as quickly as I could. The farm looked different in the daylight. The graveyard, which seemed so ominous the night before, was just a forgotten patch of land with weathered stones. The barn, too, looked just like any other old, abandoned structure, but the feeling of unease remained. I didn't stay long after that. I left the farm as quickly as I could, but the memory of the strange events lingered. I tried to rationalize it all, telling myself it was just the isolation and the darkness playing with my mind. But I knew deep down that something on that farm had been watching me. Something had been waiting, and I wasn't sure I ever wanted to know what it was. As I drove away, the last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the outline of the barn against the sky. I didn't look back again. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a weekend away to disconnect, clear my head, and enjoy the solitude of nature. I needed a break from the noise of city life, work, stress, the constant hum of everything. So, I packed up my gear, grabbed my truck, and headed to a remote campsite near the base of the mountains. The area was off the beaten path, which was exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, peaceful, just me and the trees. The drive up was smooth. I passed a few small towns along the way, each one feeling more like a memory than a present reality. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dirt road. The place had been recommended to me by a friend, and from the looks of it, it was perfect. There were no other campers around, just wide open spaces surrounded by thick woods. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs. I set up camp quickly. My tent was a two-person job, but I figured it would be perfect for just me. I had a small campfire going, and as the sun dipped lower, I could already feel the temperature drop. I cooked myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just some beans and a hot dog, but it tasted amazing in the silence. It was so quiet that even the crackling of the fire seemed like a loud noise. As night fell, I made sure to keep the fire burning. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I loved the darkness, but in a place like this, being cautious felt like the smart move. There were stories of animals around, not to mention the possibility of someone else being out there. It didn't sit right with me, the thought of another person just lurking in the woods. I kept my knife close, just in case. Hours passed. I sat back against a log, letting the firelight dance across my face. I hadn't heard anything from the wildlife, not even a rustling in the bushes. Just when I was beginning to relax, I heard it, a low, almost rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere in the woods. At first, I figured it was just an animal, maybe a woodpecker or something like that, but the tapping didn't stop. It went on for too long and it felt off, not natural. I stood up, instinctively grabbing the flashlight that was hanging from my backpack. The beam cut through the darkness, but the only thing I saw was the dense forest surrounding me. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was heavier, thicker, like the night was holding its breath. I decided to stay by the fire. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. For the first time, I felt an odd discomfort, like someone or something was watching me. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it was there, lingering. My mind raced, thinking of all the stories you hear about in places like this. Campers disappearing, strange things happening in the woods. I told myself it was all nonsense, just my nerves playing tricks on me. The night stretched on. At some point, the fire was reduced to a few glowing embers, and the air had grown colder. I figured it was time to turn in. I put out the fire, careful not to leave any trace behind. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I kept the flashlight beside me, unsure if I would be able to sleep at all. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing that tapping noise, faint but persistent, like it was right outside my tent. It would stop for a moment, then start again in the same rhythm. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I thought I heard the faint crunch of footsteps. Someone walking through the dry leaves, maybe. But when I unzipped the tent and peeked out, the woods were empty, still, and dark. I went back to my bag, telling myself it was just the wind, but it didn't feel like the wind. There was something deliberate about it. I held my breath, straining to listen, but there was nothing, just the deep silence of the woods. The next morning, I woke up late, the sun already high in the sky. My mind was tired, my nerves frayed, but I forced myself out of the tent. The world outside was peaceful, calm. The birds were chirping, the air fresh. I felt a little foolish for getting so worked up the night before. Maybe I just wasn't used to being alone in the woods. I spent the day hiking, walking deeper into the forest, hoping the exercise would clear my head. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake that feeling. The woods were beautiful, but they felt like they were hiding something, like there was a secret buried somewhere deep in the trees. That evening, I returned to my campsite. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The area around my tent looked disturbed. The dirt was churned up, like someone had been walking around it. But I was alone. My truck was still parked in the same spot, the only sign of life. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe an animal had wandered through, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. As night fell again, I sat by the campfire, watching the flames dance. This time, I couldn't shake the fear creeping into my chest. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the trees felt like a warning. And then, there it was again, the tapping sound, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. It was faint, almost distant, but it was unmistakable. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up. The sound was closer now, much closer. It was rhythmic, and now I could hear it, like a hammer hitting wood. Tap, tap, tap. I made my way toward the source of the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of the flashlight cut through the trees, but all I saw was the darkness, thick and oppressive. The tapping continued, louder now, almost deafening. Then I saw it, a figure, a man or something resembling one, standing among the trees. He was tall, his features hidden in the shadows. He didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting for me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, unable to move. The tapping stopped suddenly. A deep silence followed, and for a moment, everything was still. The figure stepped forward, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. In his hands was a hammer, the one that had been making that awful sound. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and ran, my legs burning with the effort. I didn't look back. The sounds of footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder, closer. I ran through the woods, branches slapping at my face, my heart in my throat. My only thought was to get back to my truck, to get out of there. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps never stopped. It felt like the forest itself was closing in on me. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and without thinking, I sped out of the campsite, not daring to look back. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, and by then, the sun was starting to rise. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking. I was terrified, but I didn't know who to talk to, what to say. The woods had felt alive with something that shouldn't have been there. I haven't gone back to those woods since. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that tapping sound. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel like someone is watching me, waiting for the moment when I'm alone in the woods again. I remember the summer of 2016 like it was yesterday. It was a time when I thought I knew everything about camping, enough to avoid surprises. I was 28 at the time, a couple of years into a job that kept me tied to a desk most days. But that weekend, I was going camping with my brother, Mike, and a couple of our friends. We didn't know it then, but that trip would change the way I looked at the outdoors forever. The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the city, do some fishing, and maybe hike a bit if the mood struck us. We picked a spot near a lake, deep in the woods of northern Michigan, far enough off the beaten path that we wouldn't have to deal with too many other campers. The lake itself was supposed to be peaceful, a place where fish were plentiful, the kind of place where you could spend hours in a boat without a single care. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. The air was thick with the smell of pine, the kind of scent that seemed to cleanse everything. We set up camp quickly, tents up, the fire pit dug, and fishing rods prepared. I could feel the excitement buzzing through the air, the thrill of escaping the monotony of daily life. We didn't even notice the quiet at first, the kind of silence that comes when you're miles away from civilization. It was only later that we'd realize how much that silence meant. The first few hours were perfect. We fished, laughed, and joked around. Mike caught a decent-sized bass, and we threw it back, laughing about how we'd catch the big one the next day. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The sky above us was clear, stars spread out like 1,000 little diamonds. I woke up the next morning to the sound of birds and a slight chill in the air. The others were already up, preparing for another day of fishing. I felt that same rush of excitement, the kind you only get when you're out in the wild with no one to answer to but nature. Mike and I decided to take the boat out on the lake for a few hours, while the others fished from the shore. The lake was eerily calm as we paddled out, the only sounds coming from the gentle slap of the oars against the water. I couldn't help but notice how still everything felt. It was so quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only people in the world. We joked about how creepy it was, but I didn't think much of it at the time. You get used to that kind of silence when you're camping in the middle of nowhere. We fished for a couple of hours without much luck. Nothing more than a few small perch, nothing worth keeping. When we turned back toward the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the way the trees stood around the lake, tall and silent, watching us. I tried to laugh it off, blaming the quiet for making me feel uneasy, but something didn't feel right. Back at camp, the others were still fishing by the shore. They didn't seem to notice anything unusual. We joined them, casting our lines into the water and trying to get a decent catch before we had to pack up and head home. As the sun began to set, we made plans to start cooking dinner. That's when we heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A crack, like a branch breaking, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Everyone stopped what they were doing, staring into the trees. For a moment, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded too deliberate, like someone or something was stepping through the forest. I tried to brush it off, but the others were looking around nervously. We all agreed it was probably a deer, and we went back to our cooking. But even as we ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, as we sat around the fire, a deep darkness fell over the lake. The stars above were almost lost in the vastness of the sky, and the trees loomed over us, their shadows stretching toward the campfire. I was starting to feel an unease I couldn't explain. The others were getting sleepy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At around 2 a.m., I decided to step away from the fire and take a walk. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I felt like I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the woods. The night air was cool, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots. I walked for maybe 15 minutes, and that's when I heard it again, that crack. But this time it was closer. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't an animal. It was something or someone moving through the woods deliberately, slowly. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another camper, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I turned back toward camp, but before I could take a step, I heard something else. A voice. It wasn't clear, but it sounded like it was calling out, like someone was whispering my name. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the dark woods, but I saw nothing. The light cut through the darkness, but there was no movement, no sign of life. My heart was pounding now. I couldn't explain it, but I had the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. Something or someone was out there, watching me. I turned and made my way back to camp as quickly as I could, the feeling of being followed growing with each step. When I got back to the campfire, everyone was still asleep in their tents. I sat by the fire, trying to calm myself, but my mind wouldn't let go of the feeling. I kept hearing faint sounds, cracking branches, the soft rustle of leaves, like something was moving just outside the circle of light. But every time I shined the flashlight toward the woods, nothing was there. The next morning, we packed up and headed home, all of us uneasy but trying to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. As we were leaving, we noticed something strange. The ground around our campsite was disturbed, like something heavy had been moving through the brush, right up to the edge of the camp. But the thing that made my stomach drop was the fact that there were no footprints, nothing to show where whatever it was had come from. We didn't talk much about it on the way home. Maybe it was just a bear, or maybe it was nothing at all. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with us, watching, waiting, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting for someone else to come too close. That trip, that feeling of being watched, stayed with me. I never went back to that lake, never even drove close to it. Something about that place felt wrong. I don't know what it was, and maybe I never will. But I know one thing for sure. The woods are not as empty as they seem. And sometimes, they hold secrets you don't want to uncover.